All electronic devices, including mobile phones, should be switched to silent. I would ask that any members of the public that have joined us in the room today do not interfere with the proceedings, and as soon as the hearing is closed, please leave quietly. For the purpose of the recording and the transcript, I would be grateful to everybody who speaks to ensure that they state your name and role, and for anybody who's not at the table to speak and identify themselves if they do so. So we'll just do a round of introductions. My name is Deputy Tom Coles and I am the acting chair of the panel.
David Johnson, Constable St Mary, panel member.
Deputy David Warren, panel member.
Deputy Alex Curtis, panel member.
Conotop Andy Joe, Minister for Infrastructure.
Tristan Dodd, Associate Director for Transport, INE.
Quinton Murphin, Principal Engineer, INE.
And thank you very much, Minister and the team. We have 1 hour for today's hearing, and as I indicated, this is a hearing around the road network and when changes are made. So could I start with asking, Deb, could you explain the process for determining when a layout change to our highway, carriageway and road traffic system is necessary?
Sorry.
Could you explain the process for determining?
I think that will depend on the type of change that's been implemented. So there's a number of different initiatives that we get involved in. So we get involved with the 12 other parish highway teams. So when we do village work, as we've done recently in Trinity and St John's, they would have had a village board. And that process can take many years. And I think St John's probably took about 20 years to get a crossing, which was agreed before I became minister, I should say, rather than as a result of me becoming minister. But that's a lengthy process where we have consultation, we have focus groups where people attend meetings, workshops, facilitated workshops. We set up specific questions in parish magazines if necessary. So that's one form of engagement. So those village boards will often include a member of the roads committee, not the roads committee in general. It will include interested members of the public. I know from my experience in St John, we had a former someone who was interested in road networks and had campaigned for a lower speed limit where he lived, but also had experience in an emergency services role, and another member of that team was also former emergency services, so had quite a good level of experience. So yeah, they will be appointed to those boards, parish working boards. And then we have other areas which are. We're currently doing some work at the moment. You'll be aware on the safer routes to school, which doesn't include a board set up, but a consultation will take place with people who live in the area, also the relevant roads committee from that parish or parishes, as the case may be. And so we will write to people. We'll use social media. So there's a whole way of different engagements that we utilise. Some is consultation and some is engagement. So sometimes we'll be asking people for their thoughts and ideas and suggestions, and encouraging those different ideas and thoughts at concept stage. Or if we've got a concept, we'll go to engagement mode where we'll be asking people for their views on what is proposed.
Could I just expand on that a little bit?
Yeah.
So from our starting point, we always start with state's policy. So there's the Sustainable Transport Policy, there's the St Helier Public Realm and Movement Strategy, there's the Island Collision and Casualty Reduction Plan, which is focused around road safety, and there are a number of other policies around active travel. So that's always the starting point. And consultation is really where we go out and ask the public what their issues is, what's the problem that needs to be resolved, and where there's an opportunity to provide more than one option, we will always return to them and see what the preferred option is. When we get to engagement, that's really about not the what, but the where and how, and that's about getting the detail right for trials, and some have to be trialled because you can't model traffic down to a micro level, so you need actually data to inform what you're doing. And some of them are around changes just to see what the changes in behaviour are. The other point I was going to make around that, sorry, I had another point in my mind, and basically all these things have to feed back up into those high level strategies. I'll come back to the other parts as we go along, as it comes back to me.
But, I will pick up on the point you made about collecting data. So I'm quite interested to know what sort of data points are you looking at, how they then relate to those strategies to inform the decision-making process about the changes.
Yeah.
Well, there's different types of data. So we've got the ability to measure traffic movement, cycle movement, pedestrian movement. Sometimes that's done with technology. Sometimes that's done with people doing that work. So those would be the key kind of data points that we would collect. Speed of vehicles as well, but also the volume. So it will depend on what we're trying to achieve with a specific scheme.
Do you have sort of trigger point data numbers that will say, actually, you reach to, say, well, traffic movements, you have 100 cars within an hour use a particular road, and this area is close to a school, that then this might...
So certainly measure traffic before implementing any trial, and then measure the traffic during the trial, so you've got a benchmark that you can work against. And traffic is a bit like water. If you block it off somewhere, that'll find a different way to run, and you've got to be aware of the unintended consequences of any change that you may make. So, but we would measure the traffic before any trial and during the trial.
Do you sort of have a radius of that monitoring of traffic to see,
Well, I'll have to look to my left. I don't know the technical.
Okay. So amongst the data we collect, so say for instance we were looking at a village scheme, the first thing we'd do is meet with the parishioners and ask them what the issues are with the area. Now it might be people getting to the bus stop, it might be children going to the school, it might be that traffic's going too fast or there's too much traffic. So that'd be the starting point. That would inform what data you need to collect as your baseline data. You then develop options and you would test those options against what you were trying to achieve. Now, on occasion, you get to the stage where you've got concepts, but you will need to actually do some traffic modelling. And there are pain points where you think, no, that's beyond what the public and commerce would accept in terms of disruption to their motorised journeys, no matter how much you advantage non-motorised journeys. And we've certainly done that before and advised people on that before. So we generally discount those options in. The distance it goes out on really depends on the scale of the scheme. So when we were looking at rerouting traffic around Halfday Parr Village, you might recall that, I think it was about 8 years ago, then in terms of that traffic modelling, we went from basically West Park all the way to the Rue de Pré trading estate. On other schemes, it can be much more localised.
Just because obviously at this moment in time, Broad Street is the sort of slightly controversial street, dare I use the term, and obviously that interacts with the bus service, that obviously has economic impacts as well. How do you model out something like a Broad Street being pedestrianised and the impact that has to all those different stakeholders?
That brings me back to the point I was going to make in that very first question. One of the things is, whenever you trial anything, you only ever trial something that you're reasonably confident that will work. Now, it might not be acceptable, but you wouldn't go and trial something that you think is definitely not going to work. In Broad Street, its genesis was slightly different to most projects. We had done some modelling back pre-pandemic to see what it would look like, but actually it was the pandemic which drove the closure. Okay. And then what we found was, and this was really, it was a trial by accident in some respects, is actually it worked and we could adapt the network.
What do you mean by it worked?
It worked in terms of we had relatively free-flowing traffic elsewhere. We were able to reallocate parking spaces to support people with disability. We were able to accommodate deliveries. We worked with a pharmacist and various food retailers to ensure that they could get their deliveries in and out, and retailers to ensure that people could pick up items that they needed to that were oversized. We had some noise very early on from some of the larger retailers, but that actually disappeared relatively quickly and has not come back.
So going to the next level then, obviously, sorry to carry on, so it's actually harder pedestrianisation is being looked at now, that's correct?
Yes,
Yeah.
so.
So what's caused that level to raise?
It
Well,
reads the state's reports.
So we've, I'm surprised we're talking about it, but
Sorry. I know
so
it's
Broad
already
Street's been
detailed.
closed for 4 years. 3 years ago, the Constable of St Helier brought a proposition which received widespread support in the States. Our Common Strategic Plan talks about investing in St Helier, and so that's a key part of it, is investing in our public realm. It's not a case of spending money on public realm and not on roads resurfacing, for example. We've got to invest in both, and
I think my question is more directed towards the impact it has economically, the bus routes, because one of the big feedbacks I get is if we shut the place down, you don't allow buses down there, for instance, going forward, that's going to have major implications for people's ability to use town.
Well, we're looking at...
that's why I'm asking about this general in the
so
round.
we've doubled,
how's your interaction
We've
work?
doubled the ridership on the hopper bus in the last 12 months,
Yeah.
and we're looking to do that. Significant increases again this year. We're looking at how we can enhance the hopper bus route. We've got the through tickets, which enables people to come into St Helier to the bus station and jump on a hopper bus. So not only can they access Broad Street, but they can access all parts of town, or many parts of town. We'd like it to be more. We'd like it to include Pierre Road. So we're working upon that. The Constable and I both think that we need a bus to go near the monument at Library Place end of town. But the vast majority of buses you cannot get on in Broad Street. If you're going east or west, you can't get a bus in Broad Street. So what we need to make sure is that the hopper bus, for those people who struggle with mobility, for example, we've got a bus stop right outside the market now. Historically, we would have had people walking from the market to Broad Street, where they can get a bus now to take them to the bus station. So we've got to find alternatives for those people, and we're still looking at how we would reroute the buses and the hopper bus.
Can I just sort of add to that? I mean, the starting point is, of course, the Island Plan's public realm and movement strategy. Now, that looked at the mismatch of how the character of streets and how they were used. So, are there throughways which are actually used as pedestrian thoroughfares, and these movements across the road all over the places, and and vice versa? And one of the things the public realm and movement strategy found, which is part of the evidence of the Island Plan, was that Broad Street was one of those places that was actually a pedestrian thoroughfare. Now, when we did Charing Cross, if you recall that, there was a lot of the same sort of arguments deployed as to what was happened. But what you'll see is that actually investment in those areas which have the public realm treatment follows. So we now have the Santander Business Cafe, we have various other businesses that popped up, and that's not unique. What cities and towns are found around the world, and we've looked at examples in France and in the UK, is often where you improve the public realm and you make it a nicer place to visit, to spend time, to do business, that private investment actually often follows. And so there's been a huge programme in places like Liverpool, Manchester, London, just to name some, as well as lots and lots of French towns underneath their scheme, which is called Vories pour tous. And the Minister and I, only last week, were in Belfast with the British Irish Council, and you can see the amount of investment that's gone into Belfast and the difference that's made to its shopping areas.
Taking it back a step to kind of how one engages on the wide ranges of changes, Mr. Dodge, you've mentioned that there are strategies, and the plans kind of come out of state strategies. So whether that be school travel reports that are published, the St Helier Active movement. But there's a lot to do in there, and there's also a desire to change or to do stuff. So how within all of that is the need for any of these changes then assessed when it comes to a slightly more detailed implementation, whether it be a school change or pedestrianisation, and that kind of decision that a strategy might give you a high-level view, but ultimately you've got to decide whether those small kind of piecemeal bits actually are needed or not. What's that kind of...
It might be useful to look at an example for that one, which the Minister set out in his letter to the Scrutiny panel, which was the St Saviour's School Cluster. Now, that's been on government radar going back certainly more than 15 years, but it came to the fore really with the Strong Start Sustainable Transport Policy, which said we're going to do something about that. So the starting point was obviously to collect base data. It was to survey the students and the people who use that area, which was part of an island-wide survey. And from that, we identified the main problems, and we had data as well, observations on site where people conflict with traffic in their everyday movements. And so in order to be able to prioritise that active travel option, which is ultimately the only way that you'll reduce your traffic levels, we identified a series of interventions, some as simple as crossings on Montmillet and Bagatelle Road, and the one-way in Bagatelle Lane, and we're gradually working through those. So once we've done the high-level piece, then we get into the local schemes. We letter drop 2,100 people, I think it was, to inform them of what we were considering, invited feedback, and now we're getting into the implementation phase of those. Quinton's intimately involved in it. Is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think Deputy, you're right that you know once you start looking at something like the St Saviour's school cluster, you've got a number of secondary schools. So the way that we have looked at that is both internally from the schools, the school travel plans, and then I think it was in 2022 we did an online consultation, which was essentially pin your road crossings, pavement challenges on a map, so you could identify, put marks on the map, and that created a heat map. So we've got the sort of two sides of the coin, one what the schools and the students are saying, and the other is what the wider community is saying. And from that, we've then identified what are the locations that you need to do an intervention, and we work through a number of options. And some of these areas, it is quite challenging with the road geometry to come up with options. But generally speaking, once we've come up with an option, we say, okay, this is the position to put a crossing and it meets safety requirements, then we'll go forward with an exhibition. So what we'll do is have a drop in and have a letter drop, and people can comment in on that. But once you get to that stage, it is about engagement. It's about informing people what we're doing, and we're making sure that there aren't any sort of showstoppers in terms of some sort of business access, etc. And that follows a pattern really that's pretty much customised to the individual situation, because each area that we do an intervention, there's a sort of varying spread of who's going to be affected by that. And in some cases as well, like we've done with Tris mentioned in Bagatelle Lane, we created a virtual footway. Bagatelle Lane isn't our road, it's the parish of St Saviour's, so we worked in collaboration with them to come up with a scheme that would be really beneficial for students walking from Holier through to JCG, and we put in the zebra crossing across to Holier. They worked with the residents, and there was some residents' resistance, and got that scheme in. So I think it is very much a stepwise thing, and it is a question of taking those opportunities and trying to be targeted to create those benefits.
Okay. I think one of the reasons I'm asking this is because clearly engaging on what changes, and then obviously later I'm sure we'll talk about the impact of changes as the construction impact, but obviously there is division often within any community as to whether a change is actually needed. So schools obviously, those attending school are one consultee group, those who obviously live around the area and enjoy the network in different ways are others. And it's how almost you assess the need between those sometimes competing interests.
Yeah, I think the one group that Tristan didn't talk about with the village schemes is we also talk to key stakeholder groups. So I can speak from my experience, not as a minister but as a constable. So the school was very much a key stakeholder group. The local retailers were very much a key stakeholder group. And we had all sorts of ideas and suggestions. Some people wanted traffic lights, some people wanted a race table, some people wanted a zebra crossing, and some people wanted nothing. And so we worked out the consensus was that there was demand at the focus group, there was demand for a crossing, and then we probably took the least troublesome option, which was the zebra crossing for that community. Now, I had a phone call last week, 2 weeks ago, from a resident of Trinity complaining that we didn't have traffic lights or we didn't have a raised table. So I suggested that he spoke to his parishioners about what they're doing there rather than the St John's. So it was a very, very detailed debate and discussion, and it certainly doesn't please everybody. But what is fascinating is a combination of having the new playing field at the school, but to now watch children crossing that road regularly at weekends, in the evenings, without parents. It's transforming what happens in that community. We'd like to do more. We can't be everywhere. Clearly, the Bagatelle there's a high density of schools there, so it makes absolute sense to put a lot of focus to try and find solutions. We have to work with the St Saviour's and St Helier Roads Committee for those schemes, and they don't always agree with us, and they don't always agree with each other, so that makes it challenging. But I think there was a programme. St Mary's was done many years ago, and St John's was the parish that was due to be done next, but it took almost another 10 years, I think, before we got there. But so it is a challenge as to what we do, where we do it, and we also have behind that we've got not traffic flows necessarily, but speed limits, and people want speed limit reviews, and people want speed limits raised, and people want speed limits lowered, and it depends what you use a road for in an area, what you want to do with the speed. And people ask for speed checks in green lanes, and when you do a speed check in green lane, the majority of offenders actually live in the green lane, from my experience. That's a fact. But in essence, it goes back to all of those policies we've got in place, and our collision reduction plan is very much about a blended approach from the safe systems approach, but it is about a number of treatments to help us achieve our goals. So that may be introducing traffic calming measures, it may be introducing formal junctions, maybe introducing lower speed limits, it may be a combination of those things, then goes on to talk about a whole range of other things which you're aware of. So there's always a balance, as with everything in life, and I think we're right to focus on the Bagatelle area because we should get the best results, because that's where the most schools are. But equally, I was out at Lalonde School. I don't know if you see what Lalonde School do with alternative means of getting to school, but it's fantastic. So we're trying to help them with some small infrastructure at the school where they can park their cycles. I was in Guernsey earlier this year, and we went to a school. 91% of people at that school, so teachers and pupils, arrived by alternative transport. That is amazing aspiration. Inside their school, they've got a marked out cycle proficiency course where they train young children so they can enjoy their time at school cycling rather than getting trained at the end of their time at that school before they move on. There's a whole range of things that go into it, and we have to listen to the schools, both the parents, the teachers, and the children at the schools, because we've introduced something at Trinity School as a direct result of the feedback from that community. We're currently gathering feedback from that, and I think we'll probably do some amendments. But the crossing itself has enabled the school to utilise the field across the road much easier and much safer for them. So, each scheme is different, and it's got its own merits, and it's got its own interest groups. But the stakeholder groups are really important.
First, to add slightly to that, so going back as well to your first point, expanding upon what the Minister has said, the states of Jersey have a road user hierarchy which is set out in the Sustainable Transport Policy, and at top of those are the vulnerable road users, which are considered to be elderly, young, etc. So that's the starting point, really, as to how we look at these schemes. And because you have to bear in mind that commerce has to carry on, you need free movement of traffic, people need to move, but we're trying to support those movements. And St Mary's was a very interesting example, because after we completed that scheme, we actually got a 30% increase in bus ridership.
That's right, yeah.
Because suddenly people could actually get to the bus stop and had footpaths, to move on. So for very small, inconvenient individual journeys, each individual journey is only delayed by a matter of seconds. You've got the big benefit of kids being able to walk to school, but also being able to use buses and public transport, which increases their freedom of movement around the island as well.
I've got some questions on that, but I'll save them for, I'm sure if we've got time, I'll give it back to the chair.
Yeah, so I just want to pull back because you talk about with the engagement and letter drops.
Yeah.
So how do you just, what's the methodology for your distributing of letter drops? I know at the moment we assume we might be having the automatic voter registration that will create each parish with a better database of who's where. But are you physically going around with a member of your team posting things through letterboxes? Do you have a radius around where these?
It's a combination, as my understanding. There will be some schemes where our team will drop letters, and other times we'll use Jersey Post to distribute to a specific area. So, you know the technical stuff.
I mean, what we'll do, for instance, the Minister mentioned a couple of schemes recently for the Bagatelle Safer Routes to School, and what we did, we looked at each of the 3 interventions, and we do a sort of mapping exercise to identify what the extent of this sort of significant impact on access for the local community is. You know, we don't. You know, we will go through the government media, so others in the island are aware. But once we've defined that catchment area, as it were, what we generally will do is we'll utilise the States of Jersey Gazetteer. So that's a list of all addresses on the island mapping, which is used by Jersey Post as well. So we will have every single listed address. You know, we do get instances where, and then we'll get Jersey Post to print and post that letter through every known address. We do get instances that we've had recently. I had one in Broad Street where one of the business community came and said, I'm in these multiple offices, so one letter will have gone through the door of that multiple office unit. We can't be responsible to making sure they pass it around, you know, 3 different sort of small businesses in there. So we do know it's not perfect, but we believe that that's the sort of most cost-effective way of getting that message out. And it's always supported by our comms team will put it on our website so that you can see that, and generally the media will pick up and
social media. We use social media, and you know what's in recent months we've introduced a weekly update, not for schemes but for roadworks, etc., just to try and give the public more information about what is happening on our island roads, and that's been reasonably well received. It doesn't include emergency works because we don't know where or when an emergency is going to happen, but where it's planned works, every Saturday or Sunday we put out stuff on our social media. And I'd encourage people to share that information because it is about awareness.
Yeah.
And where it's appropriate to the scheme, because we will use the parish magazine, we'll put up posters in local shops, we'll do all of the above really, and in particular we'll look to identify businesses that might be affected and meet with those businesses individually.
Is any of this a legal requirement, or is this what you're doing because you feel that it's the right thing to do or because you have to?
Can just we go to the legal part? So, as a practitioner, all changes are difficult, and if you satisfy half the people and half the people unhappy, you're probably doing quite well. Normally, with it, we do it because that gives us the evidence, and we don't want holes in the evidence to be able to go ahead to say that we have consulted, we have engaged. The legal part, the Minister will tell you, is different to that.
Yeah, I honestly don't know what the legal requirement is in terms of the consultation, but you know, I think best practice is what I would describe, and I think we do reasonably well. And as Q's just said, there will be properties that do get missed, or if it's like my house, the letter will be in the dustbin by the time I get home. You've got 13 seconds to attract somebody's attention from the letterbox to the dustbin. That's a bit of useless information I had from a previous life. But often, you know, we've just distributed 4 letters in the lead up to the major roadworks in St John's, and most people don't know they've had a letter, let alone 4 letters. So, you know, we've done everything we can in terms of social media, everything we can with the radios, etc., etc. But you know, in a multi approach, the parish magazines are very well read in my experience, and that's a good forum for us. And in my experience, you get good levels of response rates to any questionnaires you do. So,
If you're interested, I just happened to have a timeline for the consultation we did in Trinity around the changes to the village, which shows all the different channels of consultation we use, which I can hand out now or later if you.
No, do people want to see them now? Or? Yeah, we'll take.
It's more than enough there. I wasn't sure how many to bring.
Would you be able to, as these just go out, just give kind of a 30-second rundown of kind of what's on this timetable, just so the public listening can have an understanding of the scale of what you're trying to describe for us?
So Trinity Village was one of the village improvement schemes. So in the autumn of 2021, we created a board with the parish. So asked the constable to put on interesting people who are informed about what the parish's requirements were, and their principal role is to help guide communications. And so once we did that, we sent out a flyer, which is a greener travel in Trinity's Have Your Say flyer. That was delivered to every parish, every household in the parish. We advertised in the parish magazine. We then put a thank you out, and then we published the results from that. Then we advertised on the parish's website. And in the
Sorry, Tristan, just stop you there. So what was the percentaging, what was the engagement like on that particular one in 2021? Was it 1 out of 100, 10 out of 100, 50 out of 100?
My recollection in Trinity, the initial survey that we put out, I think we had several hundred responses and people were identifying their concerns. But you're absolutely right that the response rate can be is typically a 5 or 10% or something like that.
Drop, right.
Yeah,
sure.
I mean, just as a sort of contrasting example. To give you some of the challenge of this for the St John's Road scheme, when that was very much in the media and there was over 1,000 people petitioned, we attempted to do an exercise of, there's about 1,000 people in the area, and we letter dropped all of them and said, click on this link and tell us whether you think this is good or bad, or where the challenges are, etc. And actually on St John's Road, my recollection is it was under 50 responded. I think there was more than 50 in the adjoining Parade Road where the residents were quite motivated. So even when it's really high profile, the response rates you get for some of these surveys are relatively low. But that's the only way really
What do you put that down to? Well, is it hard work? Is it are the right people being engaged at grassroots level? I mean, is it the methodology? Obviously, is this government coming in and going, right, we think this is a good idea, or is this coming from the residents themselves who are saying we want this to be changed?
Just to interrupt on that point, we very much try not to come in and say this is what we're going to do to you. What we come in to say is, particularly on these village schemes, are what are your problems? And you give us the problems and we'll come up with a range of solutions to those movement problems. And then we ask them which one they prefer. And they generally settle somewhere in between two, so it's on the spectrum. And then we move to the implementation phase. And so that's the consultative bit.
Sure.
The engagement bit is when you've actually got a scheme and you say, we're going to do this now. And how do you like it tweaked? Is there any individual needs? Does the business need access to this particular entrance at this particular time? That's when people tend to come out of the woodwork because it's something that's actually happening.
Yeah, so my question really ultimately is you say actually people only get antsy when you're actually doing stuff as opposed to telling them about the stuff you're going to do. So my question is why don't you think that's a problem?
Well, this is the interesting thing, I think at least. So in the parish consultations, we'd often have 80 parishioners who would give up a Saturday morning to come and input. Often, and not on every scheme, when you have you get that implementation phase, it's actually quite a small number of people, but who are highly motivated. Mm-hmm. Now, sometimes you can accommodate their need, and you never hear about that, and that's part of the process. We will adapt schemes to suit that feedback. But just because people are being very noisy doesn't mean they're actually in the majority. The interested majority have often felt they've had this say at that point, and then are slightly bewildered when they don't get what they expected. And in the majority of cases, the truth is, the schemes do get adapted to suit.
Do you feel that kind of that two-stage, which you mentioned everything's bespoke, but kind of that two-stage approach of first asking what are your challenges and then bringing a proposal back are sufficiently understood by the public, in the sense that many people go, this is the first time I've heard of this. It may not be for your department's work to have not done the work, but they actually think that the first time they get a say on this is what we're planning, when actually they might have had a say at what are your challenges. Do you think that kind of difference has room for improvement?
My personal view is the length of time it takes for the process is far too long because people forget about it. And people who were engaged may have moved off or maybe away, whatever. So, the same goes for speed limit reviews. I think the time it takes us to do a review and then to implement is far, far too long. And so we're looking at how do we shorten that process. St John's Road, which Tris mentioned, I went and stood at the corner of Parade Road, not in a high-vis jacket, but just wearing a coat. So nobody knew who I was or what I was doing. I watched 3 cars mount the pavement within 15 minutes. And it was pretty obvious to me that we had to do something. Displacing 75% of the traffic as the original scheme proposed wasn't the answer in my view. Displacing 25% of the traffic was a simpler solution. And so that's what we did, and we worked with the parish of St Helier and the roads committee, and the feedback from the people who live in that affected area is unbelievable. It's transformed people's lives, transformed their lives. They can now use their doors and get onto the street. But if I'd have stood there in a high-vis jacket, I doubt I would have seen one person mount the pavement. Yeah. So, this is the challenge we've got. We did a traffic survey about parking in St John's. There were I don't know how many people in high-vis jackets or whatever. And we saw the takings in the village go down because people who go through St John's saw people in high-vis jackets carrying on driving to St Mary's or to Trinity. They didn't go into the shops. They thought, what's going on?
So you see there is room for improvement by following kind of more down-to-earth kind of...
Well, I think cameras are probably, or systems that measure traffic is probably far better than people in high-vis jackets because people change their behaviours. So it's really fascinating. Yeah.
What kind of just to finish on that about the pushback that you receive, you have to go back at the end to the state's road user hierarchy, because say for instance one of the village schemes, you've got people who live there who go about their everyday business. It's their home and they need to get to the shops. Now we advertise by letter drop within the parish, but we also have website surveys that extend out of the parish. Quite often the pushback comes from people who are motoring through that village, who are having their journey delayed by 15 seconds a day. It's not necessarily a significant number compared to an elderly. Just an anecdote. When we did the St Mary's scheme, I remember meeting an old guy in the graveyard there who was in his 90s, and he had he had a walking. It wasn't you, Constable. And he had a walking frame, but he was saying that since the scheme in place, he'd been able to walk up and see his wife's grave every day, and he hadn't been able to do that before.
Just to throw away a comment in a way, the recent speed limit changes in St Mary. You touched on the fact that you actually you seek consultation from those passing through, and I think the survey results, as I recall, when they come, you do break them down.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
So I mean, is there weighting you apply in decision making?
We don't.
Process?
No, we just write up what we find and make recommendations based upon government policy or state's policy, and that is who's going to benefit and what the cost is, and it's generally pretty marginal. I don't mean financial cost. I mean,
But we have had occasions where we've pointed out in those sorts of reports where there was, I can think of one particular crossing where there was strong community support for the crossing, and then as soon as it was announced, there were lots of people who used that route to drive through, and they tick the box, I'm a driver, I drive through, and they say, the comments was all negative because it was going to slow their commute home. And we set out that we actually thought that the strong community support should be prioritised over the sort of drive-through discontent, as it were. And the authority on that occasion, it was a parish authority, took that view, and the crossing did go in. So yeah, we can point it out, but you can't, and we can sort of point to policy, and that's for the decision makers, whether it's the minister or the parochial authorities.
And that ties into the casualty reduction plan as well. You know, we have a disproportionate number of vulnerable road users who are hurt in Jersey compared to the UK and other locations.
So we've mentioned about data collection before. You talked about having maybe cameras rather than people in high vis because it distracts from the real results. So I suppose what kind of tech and methodologies do you have then to collect this data to make sure it is accurate? I mean, I remember the days that they used to have those cables that go across the road that people used to drive over. But what sort of tech do you have these days to record this?
So
Black boxes.
so we use a variety of technologies. We have basically a sort of a radar type box, a replacement for those tubes, which will take the volume and the speed of traffic. Mm-hmm. We also use new technologies where they are a camera, but what the camera sees is obscured and processed within the machine, so we don't collect any data, and that can identify cyclists, pedestrians, traffic, and it can track where they're moving, so we can get sort of flows of people and how they're moving around. And then also we still do like to go on site, either incognito or in our flash jackets, but not to do the traffic counting anymore so much, really just to watch how the area is used and to get some, a real life feel to what's going in an area. And I don't think you'll ever get past that because it is about people at the end of the day.
I mean, how many of these devices do you have then, and how often are they distributed?
They're out, all of them are out all of the time. I can't tell you the number, I'm afraid. I'm not sure.
It's, I think it's currently the high-tech thing that we've got, that we've more recently got into, which has been very successful. I think it's somewhere between 20 and 30 devices, but they're not just scattered around. They're programmed and positioned for specific schemes. So we've got a variety of schemes, mainly around the St Helier, St Saviour's area. So for instance, up on the Bagatelle area where we're doing the safer routes to school, a bit prior to doing these schemes, we've got counters that they're picking up the traffic and the cyclists, but fundamentally they're looking at the number of students and adults crossing particular locations. So yeah, there's quite a bit of work in getting them to a location because we've got to go through a data protection review process. But once they're there, it's quite a rich data set.
And it's 24 hours a day.
Yeah,
that's the difference. Yeah.
And it collects the time, doesn't it? The time of the movements.
Yeah, we've got all of that.
That's really interesting.
How is that kind of new or enhanced level of data influencing or impacting how you can model the impact of a change to, let's say, the wider network around there? So where you choose to constrain movement through one road to create one travel corridor, you obviously have numbers of certain capacity. What's the feedback loop in essence to create that kind of understanding?
I think it goes back to Triss's earlier point that depend on the scheme as to the breadth that they'll use those bits of kit to measure. So if we are displacing traffic from an area, we'll measure the areas where we think the traffic is getting to and see what that impact is. And that the breadth of that would depend on the scheme.
And that comes to the importance of running a trial, does it, as well?
Yeah, so you basically, when you're thinking about a scheme, it's the degree of risk and the amount of pain that you could potentially cause commerce and individuals, how much detail you go into in terms of traffic modelling. After the scheme, it's just based on counts, so what's actually happening on the ground. Always with any scheme, whether it's temporary roadworks, it takes at least 2 weeks to settle down. But if you're trialling something, you need to trial it for a year. So you've got like data, so you've got autumn and autumn. Generally, we start actually pulling the reports together about 3 months, or pulling the data together about 3 months before the end of the scheme. We're starting to get a sense then, but until you get to the end of that year, you're not really in a position to compare.
Okay.
Yeah, so a couple of things there. You've got a year's trial. isn't there a perception that from the general public that once you put a trial in, it's kind of fait accompli? And how do you overcome that? And I think the other question would be is, can you give an example where a scheme has gone completely wrong and you've actually had to admit you had to pull back from it, and why might that have gone wrong?
So there have been schemes, but what I would say is we do an awful lot of work to make sure we're only putting forward schemes that we think will work.
I appreciate that. I
That's
appreciate
part
that
of the
point.
problem.
I appreciate that. I mean, that's
A
obviously
scheme which has gone wrong, which we've pulled out. There's not been one for a few years I can think
Not for
of.
decades.
Decades, right,
Decades ago,
Yeah.
there was one I can think of.
Okay.
Where we changed some priorities and that went wrong. I think that, in those decades, things have moved on because one of the things we do is we do an independent road safety audit. So before we put in a scheme, we've got somebody independent assessing to make sure the road safety is right. And I also think Tris is right that the sort of considerations we make before we come forward with the scheme, we do make sure that we've checked that it's got a very good chance of success. But as Tris says, that the sophistication of traffic models is improving, but it's just an interpretation of behaviour, really. So sometimes you'll put it in a model and it puts more traffic in a particular location, and it can over-predict how much there is, because what happens is people's behaviours change. They might leave a bit earlier, they might do something different. In fact, we had a drop-in consultation recently, and one of the people at consultation said, well, actually, the traffic's bad now. I walk my daughter to school, as an example of the fact that, that the traffic congestion was bad. But, from our point of view, actually getting out of your car and walking your daughter to school is helping to solve that problem. And that's one of the things that is really hard for the community to understand, that when you do bring in these changes, everybody just doesn't do the same thing, that they do change their behaviours. But you actually need a trial sometimes to actually see that adaptation happen.
If we could touch on one example on that, for example, which we asked and you replied on in a letter, Minister, on Clarence Road. Of course, that would have an impact on traffic. We expect a trial might show that. But could you give a very brief, and I'm conscious of time, kind of explanation as to how both that came about? Obviously, the fact that, opposition has arisen, and then kind of reflect, your view on the fact that, public meetings were requested by stakeholders and maybe not proactively. I'm wrapping them all up just for time, but kind of, I think this is a topic that obviously we've spoken about.
I don't know how long ago, I walked with the school from the Weybridge to the school on their walking bus, and I wish more schools would do that and more frequently. So once a week is great, but 2, 3, 4 times a week would be better, wouldn't it? So we've been working with that school for a long time before I became minister. The team came up with a scheme, and I don't understand the engineering requirements, but what I do understand is logistics. And it seemed to me that we could get the same solution by doing something during the morning and afternoon periods, term time, achieving the same result for the schools as by doing something permanently. I also accept that people who live in the roads would have seen far less through traffic than if we'd have done the scheme permanently. But the feedback from the people in the area was that they didn't want a permanent solution. So what we want to do is make it safer for the predominantly boys going to the schools, and so therefore we're looking at trialling something which will be for around an hour in the morning and an hour in the afternoon, term time only. So this is I take the same point I said earlier about St John's Road. I just go and have a look at it, and if I think it's wrong, I'll say it's wrong, and let's do something else. That's very straightforward.
I mean, 'cause that links in the temporary closure in with around St Luke's. They've obviously they close off that thoroughfare and makes it a safer walking route in there. But again, it's only that hour in the morning, that hour in the evening.
Well, I think a bigger challenge at St Luke's is removing the cars from the playground, and something I'm working with the minister on, because it's people have got their homes in that road, so you can't close it 24 hours a day, unfortunately, because people have got garages and got cars. So how do they get there? But I do think the school street works well. I've been and visited that myself, and I'm really pleased with that. And we're looking at other areas where we could do similar things.
So maybe if I can sum up something, and please correct me if I've interpreted this wrong. So when it comes to starting any sort of change to the highway and carriageways, you have your high-level strategies from varying different places and perspectives. You'll also have your parishes, and then the public can raise concerns. And these are all potential instigators for any sort of changes to the road network. You would then refer, so you've got your high-level strategies. So if the parish or the public raise a concern, you would then see how it relates back to these high-level strategies, and that's where you then start your data collection point.
Yeah, but you've just got to, I'll just remind the panel, the volume of requests we get are far greater than what we can cope
Absolutely.
with. We've got a very small team. We don't have a large budget. So we do what we can when we can by prioritising those challenges. And, some of the data that we haven't discussed would be accident data. So if there was a level of accidents, then that would get a greater priority if there weren't accidents, for example. So, and, we'd love to do more. We're currently consulting with blue badge holders, and we've had almost 350 responses to a questionnaire that we put out. I met with a group of blue badge holders last summer. And as a result of that, we've introduced the blue painted squares to try and make it clearer. I'm not sure why it wasn't clear before, but to make it clearer. Parking control tell me there's been less infractions where we've got that marking, so that's a positive. We've added 20 additional spaces, and I think Tristan said earlier, when we closed Broad Street, we replaced the blue badge places in Dumark Street. We've added 20 spaces, including 3 in Library Place because of the issues that are happening, particularly with out-of-town banks. And we're going to evaluate the feedback from those correspondents. So it's not a small group of people who are talking about they want to park outside their house or something. This has gone to every blue badge holder, almost 5,000 people, and we've got around 350 responses. So that's really positive stuff.
We're constantly in a state of consultation, is the truth. We receive letters every day, and that is a form of consultation.
Yeah.
I've got one question that I just, if we have time, Chair, which is kind of within this kind of discussion, we've talked about how changes come from, as we say, high level, and that there are competing road users. But for the public listening, where would you suggest they engage from an engagement perspective when they think fundamentally the decisions being taken or the direction of travel with regard to our road network isn't quite right? So those who believe we should take an altogether different approach, and that could be the weight given to the hierarchy of road users, it could be any of these higher level strategies. Where do you suggest they engage if they feel they're constantly up against, let's say, a tide that they disagree with, just so they feel included and they know they have a voice?
Well, we get. I meet with cyclists. I meet with taxi drivers. I meet with blue badge holders. I meet with heavy goods operators. I meet with the bus company. There's huge competing demands. Yeah, huge competing demands. The hierarchy of travel and transport. There's a huge amount of work has gone into that, and we're not doing something unusual compared to other authorities. We're doing something very, very similar. So I don't see the hierarchy of transport changing anytime soon. That doesn't mean to say that everybody's happy with that hierarchy, but I don't see that hierarchy changing. There's a huge amount of effort and work gone in. We have information on our website, incredible information. We've got the next 6 years major works on our website today, and then people are shocked when we do roadworks. So we try our very best. We can always do better, but if people want to engage, write to me, write to the department, they're very, very welcome to.
Okay.
If they write into the department's website on the email address there, then every message is logged and that's included in the evidence. Now, if they come at the doing stage, we might have been through the procurement process. They might be a bit late. The recommendation is to get engaged early on local affairs if you can. That's the best way to influence it, but because if it's after the event, we do our best to accommodate it.
The other thing that's important to mention is the road safety team
So the road
monthly.
so the road safety request review panel. So you've got the strategy coming from the top, but you've also got bottom up where people all over the island are concerned about how people behave in their cars outside their house or on their everyday journey. So we get a number of requests every month, tens and tens of them. And what we do is we take those requests, we do a report on them, we analyse the site, look at the geometry of the road, we look at the traffic speeds, pull the data together, and then we say either we can help. Now, it might be in terms of road engineering, which is costly and takes a long time, but it might be passing it on to enforcement authorities or education, or otherwise we can't because of the geometry of the road or
That group meets
constraints.
monthly.
They meet monthly, yes.
Yeah.
And it's a mixture of professionals.
So is that part of your, I wasn't aware of that one.
So that's how we deal. So road safety requests, everyone that comes through goes past the panel consider a pack of evidence around it, and then we respond to the individual. Now, there can be a delay in that because sometimes you have to go out and collect further information, and there's always a backlog of requests.
I know one of my parishioners wrote in only this week, you tell me, and I think he just wrote into infrastructure, so should he better direct it to?
No, right into I&E, to infrastructure,
so it will get passed on
and
back.
it will go to the panel and they will make a response.
Yeah, well, it might not get to the next month's meeting because they capture data, but we as I know roads committees write in sometimes and ask for feedback. So yeah, that panel, and it's made up. I've seen them in action. It's quite a cross representation from the department who will analyse the feedback.
They are department members, are they, rather than outsiders?
They are department members, but where we do use external independent auditors where we're considering schemes and when we've implemented schemes to review that. And that includes the removal of white lines where we've done some resurfacing work, where the road is less than 5 metres wide. We've taken away the white line. A lot of people don't like that, but the reality is that traffic generally slows as a result.
We are just coming up to the end of our hour, so I'd just like to give you the opportunity to, if there's anything you'd like to express to the panel on this subject that we haven't asked.
No, we thank you for the opportunity to talk to you. We constantly evolving. We'd love to do more. We'd love to do things quicker, but the team do a great job, in my opinion. And we'll never please everybody. It's a difficult job. But we've got to do our best, and the team do their best with the resources that are available to them, and we'll continue to do that.
Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Minister, for your time today and answering the panel's questions. And I'd also thank the officers as well for their time. If we have any further questions, we will follow up in writing. But at that point, thank you very much, and we'll draw this meeting